Hello, and welcome to a bonus box of Warhammer 40k's Grim History from the Beyond. I'm Zeckthar, and for the next couple of weeks, we will be talking about the Sabbat Crusades.
Now last week we left off with Makaroth and his crusade finally pushing the forces of chaos back, thanks to his victory at the fortress world of Moorland, and the re-emergence of the living saint, Saint Sabbath. The forces of the arch-enemy had faltered, their morale shattered, and their spirit broken. The Magisters had ultimately failed where it really mattered, as this calamitous effect of their defeats spoiled their carefully strategized maneuver. Soon the news of the reborn saint spread amongst the ranks of the crusade, inspiring their impetus to drive forwards and deny the Archon's minions. Only the forces of Magister Anwar Sek managed to maintain any type of solid cohesion in the face of these imperial victories. Sek was possibly the most gifted strategist in the Sabbat worlds in the service of the ruinous powers. There were even troubling intelligence reports reaching Makaroth that Sek was building his own army to rival the Blood Pact, the Sons of Sek. At this critical juncture in the crusade, War Master Makaroth redeployed several of his most experienced subordinates, including Lord Militant Sibon and Marshal Blackwood, to seemingly unimportant theaters at the rear of the flanks of the crusade's advance. His reasons for doing so were not clear. His critics said he was pushing members of the Old God aside to give his own favorites the chance to win glory. However, it was equally possible that the War Master was anticipating another flanking attack of the kind that had such disastrous effects in the Cabal system and the Khan group, and was sending his best subordinates to where they would do the most good. The newly established Second Front in the Khan group soon began its thrust forwards to drive through its opposition and finally protect the vulnerable flanks of the Crusade's forces, with the War Master's stubborn assault on the fortress world of Moorland finally succeeding at the close of 773.M41. As of 775.M41, an Imperial victory within the Sabbat world sector appeared to be nearly inevitable. By 778.M41, the Sabbat World's Crusade was now entering a defining phase in its 23rd standard year, having successfully advanced into the highly contested territories of the Cabal system and beginning to make significant headway into the Carcharodon cluster. This hostile region was considered to be the heartland of the forces of chaos within the Sabbat worlds. Overall Imperial victory was believed by the Crusade's high command to be achievable in as little as 5 standard years. However, there were those who cautioned against the folly of hubris, believing that a number of factors could just as easily prove disastrous for the Crusade's ultimate success. Over the course of more than 2 solar decades of fighting, the fortunes of the Imperium during the Crusade had reversed on more than one occasion. There were 2 factors that could hamper Imperial forces to achieve total victory in the sector. First, the fighting within the Cabal and the Carcharodon regions was on a scale unseen. Secondly, the Khan group was still beset by the forces of the arch-enemy, many of which were attempting to effect a counter-strike. In his haste, War Master Makaroth left many unresolved conflicts in his wake. Those commanders on the Second Front were left to handle the arch-enemy forces and win, at any cost, preventing them from driving at the flank of the crusading forces. One such place was the world of Lyubov. Now, the world of Lyubov was considered a strategically useful location on one of the main jump routes, and was also believed to be a source of fuel, munitions, and other consumables for the arch-enemy forces within the Khan group. Lyubov had effectively been conquered in 750.M41, suffering under the occupation of the arch-enemy for 2.5 solar decades. Several hive cities still managed to remain under Imperial control for the majority of that time, with major wars being waged on the ground as a result. Lord Militant Sibon ordered Lyubov to be retaken in late 777.M41, giving responsibility to General Andreas Karnheid. Now, General Karnheid was a veteran Austro Militarum commander with a prestigious and long military career that predated the state of the Crusade in the Sabbat worlds. Serving under the former War Master Slato during the Kuluan War, which took place between 752 and 754.M41, Karnheid had risen as one of the War Masters chosen to ascend to the command echelon at the beginning of hostilities. Prior to the Lyubov campaign, Karnheid's service during the Crusade remained unglamorous, as circumstances often found him commanding deployment garrisons or forces in transit. After the death of Slato in 765.M41, Like many of his contemporaries, Karnhide found himself fallen out of favor with the new War Master. With nothing to prove in terms of loyalty and ability, many veteran commanders such as Karnhide found themselves relegated to the onerous chores associated with the Second Front Command. General Karnhide was not selected for the job of liberating Lyubov on merit, but rather circumstance. Lord Militant Sabbat tasked the only senior officer he felt he could spare, as the Khan group was overstretched and beset by 3 significant conflicts. Though he was given command of a sizable liberation army, they were an ad hoc formation, meaning that they were an army comprised of disparate units who had not served together operationally, slapped together in the quickest of time and given to General Karnhide with a simple note of good luck. Many of these units had seen significant service on the front for an excessive amount of time and desperately needed to be retired and restated. Sabbat more than likely used the general's task force as a stopgate measure to keep Lyubov busy until such a time when the Lord Militant could eventually claim victory for himself. Unfortunately, Sabbat greatly misunderstood the threat level of Lyubov, which would eventually prove to be worse than anyone suspected. The forces of Chaos arrayed against General Andreas Karnhide on Lyubov were significant. Within the occupied zones, there were substantial Chaos cult armies and levies of forcibly conscripted citizens from the indigenous population that had been tainted by the touch of the warp. They occupied the transcontinental nexus, a heavily populated zone where the bulk of the planet's hive cities and manufactory lay. These forces were augmented by numerous war machines, armor, aircraft, corrupted Chaos Titans, and even a considerable number of traitor Chaos Space Marines. The Chaos Army was further supplemented with the deadly and ferocious clan army of the Blood Pact. These forces of the archenemy were commanded by a being known as Eric Ottogar. Imperial scholars believe that the name Ottogar is a rank of honorific meaning sub or demigod, perhaps denoting an equivalent rank comparable to colonel or general. This capable and charismatic leader had forged the usual desperate forces of Chaos into a unit of command, making the archenemy occupation further into a singular, coherent structure. This is what awaited the Imperial forces on Lyubov. Planning the successful liberation of Lyubov was a difficult undertaking, for the bulk of the separate fronts considered for a mass drop assault were too active and defensible. 19 separate plans for the initial assault were rejected by General Karnhide and his planners, including the strategic points of Sredi Bay, Zinc Hill, and Kazenburg. Principal assault on Lyubov Hive was deemed unfeasible so long as these outer cities were still active. Having obtained a substantial amount of useful intelligence on the Nexus Zone, most objections to these various drop point plans were made by Karnhide's infantry commanders. This was mainly due to the considerable air coverage of the archenemy interceptor squadrons. These hunter-killer squadrons were hard to track and kill from orbit, for they were based upon mobile land carriers that made it all but impossible to track their whereabouts. The substantial number of enemy fighters would make any drop assault a suicidal proposition, whilst large formation of enemy stoop bombers would swiftly annihilate any Imperial forces that managed to somehow make it to the surface intact. Considering his options carefully, Karnhide posed the problem to his Imperial Navy officers. The general initially wanted the fleet commanders to bring their ships into a much tighter and lower orbit, from which they would be able to more accurately target these land carriers. But the naval officers were unwilling to risk their line ships against the range of the archenemy's huge anti-orbital batteries. Instead, they devised a daring but risk-worthy plan of their own. Flight Marshal Kared Haidun of the Aeronautica Imperials presented an audacious plan to send 8 massed waves of Imperial fighters ahead of the troop drop to engage the enemy aircraft head-to-head for an air superiority. Though normally such a bold tactic would be frowned upon by most commanders of the fleet, their subordinate pilot officers saw merit, relishing the notion for such a challenge. In this particular theater, the commanders of the major vessels were willing to risk their fighters, rather than the main vessels. An accord was reached by the various commanders, and with the blessings of General Karnhide, the plan was approved. The massed waves of Aeronautica Imperialis fighters, made up predominantly of Thunderbolts, but also included some wings of Lightnings, began to attack at 0 hour on day 1. This phase included a large, full-scale battle that involved almost 30,000 Imperial aircraft and some 45,000 enemy warplanes. At the height of the engagement, nearly 63,000 Imperial warplanes would be committed overall. Seredi Bay, Bulk Cliff Hive, and Zinc Hill regions were the principal attack zones, with the most intense air battles being fought on the first and third solar days of the operation of Seredi Bay and on day 4 at Zinc Hill. In the second solar week of the air war, a 9-hour engagement ensued over the coastal zone at Bulk Cliff Hive. By the third solar week of the air war, the forces of Chaos air power had been greatly reduced to only a third of its starting strength. Lyubov was now vulnerable to a full-scale Imperial ground assault, with the loss of its defenders' air support. After over 2 solar weeks of air combat, the forces of Chaos were well aware that the Imperium was about to launch a massive ground assault and prepared accordingly for the fight to come. The land war was now ready to commence, and even though the air was clear for a full-scale orbital drop assault, the Austromilitarum was once again resistant to the general. Karnheit understood their reluctance, and instead of ordering them to attack, he showed intuitive understanding that the answer to his problem lay with the forces of the Adeptus Mechanicus
and their mighty war machines, the Titans.
Carefully formed by War Master Slato at the inception of the Crusade, the Mechanicus had entered into cooperative pacts for the tentative use of their war machines. Though invaluable, the Mechanicus was an organization that was prone to act autonomously, with a reluctance to be commanded by a Crusade general. The priests of Mars continued to show their displeasure with the progress of the Crusade, enduring the hardships that entailed longer than led to be expected by the former War Master. They grew increasingly dissatisfied with having to provide ever greater quantities of their war machines. Makaroth had done little to appease the Mechanicus, and their forces assigned to the Second Front resented not being part of the primary campaign. Karnheit possessed a reserve of over 130 Titans in this task force. Now, mind you, the majority being the smaller scout-grade Warhound-class Titans, and knew that these war machines of the Mechanicus could break the arch-enemy ground forces, opening the way for the Austromilitarum and its armor. Spending solar hours in careful orchestrated talks with the senior adepts of the Mechanicus assigned to the Crusade, Karnheit reasoned that the War Master sought triumph and glory, and those units that exhibited the most courage and zeal would more than likely be summoned by Makaroth to the front lines where the true glory lay. Karnheit promised the Mechanicus that if he garnered their full support, he would send directly to the War Master reports of the ground assault on Lyubov, being led by Mechanicus forces. And so, the very next day, the Mechanicus led the assault on 3 target zones: Seredi Bay, Bulk Cliff Hive, and Zinc Hill. Long-range orbital bombardment and carpet bombing preceded the Titan landings. Instead of dropping in and then advancing on the targets, the Titans landed and radiated from the landing zone. At Zinc Hill and Zerad Hive, large areas of territory were cleared in this way. 23 solar hours after the successful Titan operation deployment, the Austromilitarum forces mobilized en masse in a full-scale drop assault composed of 2.6 million troops in the first wave. The Imperial Guard targeted the 3 main zones that the Titans had already cleared of the defenses of the archenemy forces. A 4th drop force, composed predominantly of regiments of the Carnelian Lightfoot, targeting Kazenberg Hive, successfully wrestled control of the automatic defenses and swiftly brought it back into use by Imperial occupational forces. Though it was the second largest hive city on the planet, the Guard force managed to take Kazenberg the fastest and most easily, with the least collateral damage. Zinc Hill was another matter entirely, as it soon proved to be the toughest of the targets to conquer. Being the most resistant of the Mechanicus Titan assault, they still retained some air cover, using it to their advantage. Advancing under armor support, the second wave of Austromilitarum troops advanced upon the subsidiary Hive City. As the Imperial forces attempted to storm the western wall of the main hive, a massive battle erupted. The archenemy deployed many bizarre engines of destruction, shredding both troops and body armor with thereto unknown mechanized heavy mortars that spat high-velocity razor chaff. Fortunately, these weapons proved to not be durable, as they were soon destroyed by the Guard's field batteries and their sustained heavy bombardments. It took 3 solar days of constant warfare to finally breach the western wall. Invading the outer ring of the Hive City, the Austromilitarum forces soon encountered a concealed and dug-in enemy force, and their nightmarish ditchwork of trenches and foxholes. Vicious trench warfare ensued for another 2 solar days, until the Imperial Titan Vanglory Tumultus was brought in to clear the path. The ground forces sustained a high number of casualties. Chaotic street fighting soon ensued, as the Astra Militarum were continuously harangued by poorly armed Chaos Cult zealots. Karnheim wisely rendered command in the field to those officers on the ground who would be able to make split-second decisions to deal with the fluctuating threat as the situation dictated. After further investigation, it was revealed that the difficulties faced by the Imperial forces were due to the fact that Eric Ottogar had made his base of operations at Zinc Hill. The archenemy forces had acted accordingly, making the site one of ritual importance, defending it with fanatical vigor. Ottogar may have been present at the time of the Imperial invasion, and the vigorous defense put up by archenemy forces was used to bide him time to escape and flee to Lyubov Hive. With the successful pacification of the southern portion of the transcontinental nexus, Karnheim's attention next turned to the gigantic main hive city, Lyubov Hive. As the majority of all existing enemy resistance had retreated to this veritable fortress, Karnheim knew this objective represented numerous problems for his overall strategy. In the years of Chaos occupation, the forces of the archenemy had turned the Hive City into a nearly impervious fortress with a heavily armored outer structure, while also embellishing it with innumerable gun emplacements and malevolent anti-personnel devices. The ancillary Hive cities of Zanik and Zevin that lay to the west also proved to be a problem, as these two hives fed primary power reserves into Lyubov Hive. An overlapping system of defensive trenchers, dikes, and armored traps lay to the south and southwest, constructed in a wide crescent many hundreds of kilometers long, and partly mined. It would be a major chore just to get to the main hive. Karnheim's senior staff offered numerous conflicting schemes regarding how to best take the formidable Lyubov Hive. Instead of choosing a single plan of attack, the general once again displayed keen insight and remarkable fluidity of thinking by deciding to embark upon simultaneous 3-pronged assault that incorporated all of these various plans. Though it was seen as indecision by his peers at the time, Imperial history would later vindicate Karnheim. Dividing his forces into 6 separate armies, the general also divided his commanders to lead their respective forces and carry out the various plans that each commander had recommended. Led by Major General Arkell, the First Army would maintain a firm occupation of the areas already taken, providing a slow siege of the main hive city to wait the enemy out and standing in reserve if necessary. The Second Army, mostly composed of motorized light infantry, was to be commanded by Colonel Hayek. His forces were also to be kept in reserve and support position outside Sradhive, ready to deploy at a moment's notice. Karnheim himself would command the Third Army and commence a frontal assault on Lyubov Hive, cutting a patch through the defensive system. Under the command of General Doshin, the Fourth Army would encircle Lyubov Hive and around the eastern fringe and attack it from the northeast sector. Such a plan had been recommended by Doshin himself. The 5th and 6th armies would be composed of smaller motorized forces, commanded by Colonel Paquin and Colonel Varnsetter, respectively. Their primary objectives were the ancillary hive cities, with the 5th Army severing communication with the main hive, while the 6th Army struck at Zeven and Zenik simultaneously. Using his superb diplomatic skills and a bit of guile, Karnheim once again made use of the Imperial Navy and the Adeptus Mechanicus forces to help his overall strategy succeed. He manipulated the 2 separate organizations by insinuating that he would hate to see them robbed of all their share of the climactic glory by the Austro Militarum forces on the ground. The Mechanicus immediately seconded their war machines and titans to the 3rd and 4th armies, while the Imperial Navy's Aeronautica Imperialis would conduct precision airstrikes on the coastal power farms of the ancillary hives. They would then provide air cover for the 5th and 6th armies. Colonel Paquin and Varnsetter initiated the attack by striking deep at the southern side of Zeven and Zanik. Paquin's 5th Army succeeded in cutting off all communications with Lyubov Hive by severing the mass transit and cable links within a single day, and then turned west towards Zanik. The Navy did its part by reducing the power farms to smoking craters with its deadly air power. The 6th Army managed to break into the southern side of Zeven, but the advance soon ground to a halt after facing ferocious resistance. The Astra Militarum soon came face to face with significant numbers of the Blood Pact for the first time since the invasion began. On the move for the better part of 3 solar days, Major General Doshin's Fourth Army swung around to assault the northeastern margin of the main hive. They were soon met by huge numbers of enemy armor, composed principally of units of the Blood Pact, armed with captured and customized Imperial battle tanks. An enormous armored battle soon erupted on the northeastern plains. Meanwhile, the large Third Army force commanded by General Karnhide dug a path through the rudimentary but deadly defense systems erected by the arch-enemy. Fortunately, the strength of the Mechanicus war machines served well by destroying and clearing these lethal defenses, losing 2 Titans in the process, but ensuring that by the end of the first day, the outer walls of the Hive City were in sight. In spite of this success, Karnhide soon received negative reports of the 6th Army being fought to a standstill by the Blood Pact forces, and the 4th Army being pushed back and slaughtered. Pleading for support from the reserves, both commanders were refused by Karnhide. Though his decision was viewed as cold and heartless, Karnhide knew he could not spare them, for he would soon need the reserves to reinforce his main assault. Though he wanted to support the efforts of his beleaguered officers, he had full confidence in both commanders to accomplish their individual objectives. In less than 24 solar hours, his confidence was rewarded. Colonel Varnsetter managed to launch a thrust into the Blood Pact forces, driving them back about 3 kilometers into Zevin. Moving with all speed, Colonel Paquin moved in to support the 6th Army in a counterstrike, bringing the 5th Army into a pincer movement on the Blood Pact's vulnerable left flank. The Navy air wings heavily supported their efforts, attacking both the Blood Pact and Zevin and key positions within the Hive City. It would take 9 more solar days of fierce warfare before a conclusive Imperial victory could be claimed against the ancillary hives, with exceedingly high casualties as a result of their troubles. General Doshin redoubled his efforts on the northeastern front, bolstered by the news that the Blood Pact was not as invincible as their reputation suggested. He then ran the heavy armor and Titans in his command into a long, tight angle of attack across the hydroelectric valleys of the East Lyub River. Battalions of light support and anti-tank units were simultaneously directed in an encircling maneuver around to the north. Soon, a second, fierce tank battle erupted, but the general's gambit proved to be successful. The Blood Pact war machines fell back and attempted to reform into a cohesive force, but many soon found themselves easy targets for the advancing Imperial armor, and were destroyed before they could reassemble. Forced to retreat towards the flanks of the main Hive City, the Blood Pact armor broke into 2 distinctive elements. The first was annihilated by advancing Warhound Scout Titans and tank destroyers outside the main eastern gate. The other element soon faced the encircling light support battalions, which picked them off at their leisure, breaking their cohesion as an effective fighting force. The light support and tank destroyers continued to pick off the last of the Blood Pact's war engines as Doshin's main force advanced to assault the outer defenses of Lyubov Hive. Karnhide's 3rd Army broke past the defensive systems, crossing the outer road networks, near the main hive itself, just as they received word that Doshin's forces began their assault. Taking heavy fire from the gun emplacements and hardpoints that studded the hive's outer perimeter, the Imperial drive started to falter under a relentless barrage. Even the Imperial commissars balked at the prospect of advancing into the deadly barrage of cannon fire, batteries, las fire, and flamers. But the Imperials hardened their resolve and drove forward into the heart of the enemy. General Karnhide's 3rd Army penetrated the southwestern perimeter of Lyubov Hive on the early hours of the campaign's 17th solar day. Ferocious urban fighting ensued as the archenemy countered the Imperial assault with a well-orchestrated resistance, meeting them at every step of the way. Karnhide was soon forced to call in support from the 2nd Army, sooner than he anticipated. The brutal fighting ensued unabated for the next 80 solar hours. News of Doshin's forces breaching the main hive perimeter in the northeast and also driving in towards the hive city's core reached them 46 solar hours into the period. Though the general's spirits were lifted by the good news, his hopes were soon dashed as the Blood Pact once again proved to be an implacable foe that fought with stealth and guile. For every small victory and every inch of ground taken, the Blood Pact made the Imperials pay deeply, laying traps, setting ambushes, mining tenements, and employing snipers and booby traps. After 80 solar hours of continuous fighting, Karnhide finally relented and called a halt, allowing the frontline forces to retire and be replaced. The fighting dulled somewhat for a short period of time, but by hour 85, Karnhide pressed his forces onward again. As the Imperials made a furious thrust into the wounded Hive City, they encountered fewer blood-packed forces, as this latter stage and more levies of Chaos cultists. A great fire soon broke out in the main Hive City's northern sectors, burning unchecked until 1/5 of the Hive was consumed. It was speculated that this fire was the result of stray munitions, but was more likely caused by enemy sabotage. Karnhide focused on his main goal of finding and destroying the focus of Lyubov resistance, Eric Ottogar. He drove his forces relentlessly forward, knowing full well that victory was within his grasp. Late on the 73rd solar day of the campaign, 3 fire teams from the 82nd Karnalin Lightfoot finally ran the Ottogar to ground. Driving ahead of the main advance, the fire teams encountered unexpected resistance from a squad of blood-packed warriors. A firefight ensued, which left 3 of the foes dead on the causeway outside and forced the remainder of the enemy back down into the vandalized sensorium. Checking for signs of life, the Imperial medic noticed the dead foes weren't attired like the average blood-packed warrior. Alarmed by this unusual turn of events, the squad leader soon alerted command for support. The fire teams soon found themselves under renewed fire from the sensorium before any support could arrive. They encountered stiff resistance from all quarters, but the Imperials valiantly fought on. By the time a squad of Karskin specialists arrived to support the beleaguered fire team, the squad leader believed he had spotted the rogue Ottogar. He pursued him with 2 other members of his squad through a lower quad and towards the west door of the sensorium. Cornered, the Ottogar drew his barbed chainsword, snarled like a cornered animal, and lunged to attack. His 2 subordinates were swiftly cut down, and the squad leader missed Ottogar with his first 2 shots. With 1 charge in his weapons power pack remaining, the squad leader fired one last time into the snarling face of his foe. As the enemy crumpled to the ground, the squad leader gulped, and with wide eyes holstered his pistol. Eric Ottogar was finally dead. Though it later came to light that the squad leader had actually missed, and the headshot was claimed by one of the Karskin marksmen in an adjacent building. Yet regardless, the deed was done. Sporadic fighting continued for several weeks afterwards, but eventually an Imperial victory was declared after the successful conclusion of the Lyubov campaign. From the very beginning of the Lyubov campaign, General Andreas Karnhide had numerous obstacles arrayed against him. He was given a poorly supplied and equipped ad hoc force of mixed units and still managed to achieve what was thought to be an unlikely victory. Karnhide was a genius at understanding how to use the disparate parts of his command coherently, and his command allowed them to function at their best. He knew how to play to the strengths of the various organizations under his command and make them an asset, bringing out the best in his troops through respect for their opinions and initiative, even as the forces of chaos often did the opposite. General Karnhide should have achieved glory and honor in light of his great Imperial victory. But, alas, it was not to be. Though he would achieve his assigned objective and drive the Chaos forces from Lyubov, ending their threat to the advancement of the Crusades front across the Sabbat World sector, General Karnhide was accused of wavering and indecision, with his peers casting doubts on his strength of character and even his ability to command, largely as an act of political vengeance orchestrated by Saibon, when it became clear that he had badly misjudged the situation on Lyubov. Lord Militant Saibon even had the gall to berate Karnhide for allowing elements under his command to do as they will, which of course was the tactical flexibility that had allowed Karnhide to claim the victory in the first place. Karnhide was deeply wounded by this criticism. He eventually went on to publish his own account of the actions of Lyubov and retired from the Crusade and Imperial military service altogether. 18 months later, he committed suicide, dying from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Now, unfortunately, this is where my research goes dark. From what I've gathered, Makaroth's next major objective seems to be to wrest Urdesh from the grip of chaos, denying the archenemy their largest source of armored vehicles and other major industrial assets. Lord Militant Saibon is still working at the back, which he feels that a warrior such as he should be at the front line of advance, not being sent to the rear to
mop up the dirt.
In a communique to the War Master, he complained incessantly of being relegated to such an unglamorous position, and the grievous insult to his honor. He asked if he truly had to continue to undertake such a menial task. Makaroth answered him, bluntly, the following solar day by responding with a single word. Yes. Several of Makaroth's senior commanders soon found themselves charged with the prosecution of the Second Front, including General Van Voits, Kelso, Bulletin, if you remember that guy from last week, and Lushvim, Marshal Blackwood, and Lord Militant Hummel, as well as Saibon himself. Their impalatable task was to defend and push back the Chaos counterattack, but this meant they had to retake well-fortified enemy worlds that Makaroth had bypassed, on his way to extending the Imperial salient deep into the Sabbat world sector. Saibon would be relegated to this position for the remainder of the crusade, reluctantly following the War Master's orders to the bitter end despite his disdain for his mission and his commanding officer. Well, folks, that's all I got. My apologies for the seeming cutoff, but that really is all the information I have. But before I go, how about another short Gaunt story? Now, after the protection detail of the Saint, the Sabbat World Crusade entered a new phase. The 10th First were assigned to the Ancreon Sextus Theatre, but shortly after arriving, Lord General von Voits approached Gaunt with the news that his old foe, Nox Sturm, had fallen into Chaos hands whilst en route to his court-martial. Sturm's memories were mind-locked, but if his interrogators could break the mind lock, they would discover many sensitive details about the Ostra Militarum and the Sabbat World's crusade. Feeling responsible for the situation because he hadn't executed Sturm when he had had the chance, Gaunt volunteered to lead an EZ-level insertion, an assassination mission to the enemy-occupied planet Geryon, where Sturm was being held. In a display of loyalty and devotion, many ghosts competed for a place on what was probably a suicide mission. The final team was Gaunt, Major Ellen Braun, Owen McCull, Sniper Larkin, Scout McVenner, Scout Bonin, Trooper Beltian, Alongus Broston, Keglin Varl, Merton Fagor, Tona Crid, and Anna Kurth. Making landfall in contact with the local resistance, they were able to gather intelligence on the Electicia Bastion, where Sturm was being held, but had to contend with occupation forces at every turn. A hunter-killer team of Chaos Space Marines were dispatched to eliminate them, and the 10th retreated into Geron's Until Marshes, home of the tribal partisans who resisted Imperial control. Ignorant of the dangers of Chaos, the partisans revealed their presence to the Chaos Marines, who attacked the partisans' village, but were all killed in the ensuing firefight. As recompense, the partisan leader offered his third son, Ezra Ap Nit, to Gaunt as a guide, and Gaunt accepted, completely unaware that the entirely literal tribesmen had just made Ezra Gaunt's permanent servant. The Tanith were then able to coordinate with the Resistance, who launched a diversionary assault on the Electicia Bastion, but were butchered by the Sons of Sek, the elite Chaos military loyal to Magister Anaquana Sek, being trained on the planet by Mabon Etolgar, a Blood Pact defector, and Sturm himself, whose mind lock had been broken. However, the diversion allowed the Tanith to infiltrate the fortress and ultimately force Sturm's suicide, the traitor general taking his own life in shame after the memory of his cowardice on Vergas returned. Gaunt was then almost killed by Sturm's vengeful life ward, Desolate, but Fagor shot it from behind with Larkin's longlance, saving his life. Though the Tanith team succeeded in eliminating Sturm before he could divulge important information to the enemy, Beltane's Voxcaster was irreparably damaged in the fighting and they were left stranded on Geryon. They spent the next year and a half honing the Geryon resistance into an effective guerrilla force that constantly harassed and undermined the occupation, weakening it enough that smugglers became able to sneak into the planet. It was one such smuggler that eventually became the Tanith's means of escape, though McVenner and Kurth both chose to stay on Geron with the Resistance. Gaunt's time on Geron had a profound effect on him, just as it did the rest of the team. Already a hardened veteran, spending the best part of 2 years on an enemy-occupied world turned Gaunt into an elite commando, with a stealth and reconnaissance skill that were among the best in the entire Militarum. It also burned away most of his remaining compassion, and further inured him to the horrors of chaos, though he retained his humanitarian philosophy of leadership and command. As for his men, well, they were already elite commandos. This just put their skills of stealth and sneakiness at Jedi level. Unfortunately, Gaunt and the Geryon team's return to the Imperium was not a smooth one. The Imperial Command rightfully doubted that anyone could spend almost 2 years on a chaos-held world without being tainted, and suspected Gaunt and his men of being spies. And so they were locked in a cage like animals and scheduled for execution until Gaunt was able to convince his jailers of his identity. Taken to Imperial HQ on Encreon Sextus, Gaunt and his team anticipated similar treatment and escape confinement, Gaunt taking General von Voigt hostage to ensure his safety and the safety of his team. While this worked, it also got Gaunt arrested and put on trial for his actions. Gaunt was cleared after a few days, but his expected return to command of the Tanith First was not to be. Colonel Korbeck's death, plus Gaunt, Ron, and McColl's extended absence on Geryon, had left the Tanith without most of their commanders, and they had been merged with the Belladon 81st, another light infantry regiment that also specialized in reconnaissance. The Belladon 81st had suffered heavy casualties in previous engagements, but still had most of its command structure, and it was combined with the Tanith 1st to create the 81st 1st Recon. The new regiment's commander was Belladon Colonel Lucian Wilder, who had earned the respect of the Tanith whilst leading them into combat on the Sparshade Mons, one of Ancreon Sextus's massive steppe cities where the Blood Pact had dug in. Unable to return to his old regiment, Gaunt was demoted to a regular commissar and toured the theater with Nahum Lud, a junior commissar assigned to him who had advocated for Gaunt during his trial. During this time, they discovered that regimental chefs from Fortis Binary had been putting meat from battlefield corpses into the food, causing obvious sickness, and nearly escaped an ambush by a Chaos Predator. Sparshed Mons was eventually discovered to be a massive trap designed to tie up and consume Imperial forces, and all regiments were ordered to retreat ahead of an orbital bombardment. The 81st First were too embroiled in combat to retreat in time, so Colonel Wilder led a last stand, which allowed most of the regiment to escape. Wilder's heroic death allowed Gaunt to resume command of the Ghosts, now with another cultural group, the Belladon, as part of the regiment. Gaunt's first mission, as reinstated commander of the new Tanith First, was to lead the regiment back to Geryon as part of a massed Imperial liberation force. The Ghosts played a small but crucial role by bridging the gap between Imperial command and the Geryon resistance, and Gaunt was reunited with Kurth, who returned to the regiment, but was dismayed when inquisitorial forces forcibly colonized the Until in a misguided search for a substance that could bolster humanity's resistance to Chaos Tame. Thankfully, someone freed all the partisan prisoners shortly after Gaunt's departure. The Ghost's next mission was the fortress world Jago, where General von Voigt assigned the Tanith to the ancient abandoned fortress of Heinzerhaus. The Ghosts encountered a number of difficulties occupying the fortress, including incomplete maps and severe water shortage, and were soon fighting for their lives when the Blood Pact stormed Heinzerhaus in unexpected heavy numbers. Gaunt was wounded in the thick of the fighting and captured by the enemy, but due to the extreme chaos of the battle, it took a while for word to filter through the whole regiment. Not until Sergeant Varl was found lying among the wounded and was able to tell his story did the Tanith learn what had happened. Taken alive, Gaunt had been carried outside the fortress by an enemy squad who attempted to carry him down a cliff. But rather than face prolonged torture, Gaunt used his sword to sever the team's ropes, killing the entire enemy squad and himself. In the aftermath of Gaunt's death, Major Ron took command of the Tanith's regiment for what seemed to be their final hours. Now, unbeknownst to him, both Ezra and McColl abandoned their posts in search for Gaunt and, if possible, retrieve his body, teaming up to infiltrate the Blood Pact camp and cause as much damage as possible. There they found Gaunt tortured and blinded, but alive, having survived the fall and been captured anyways. They were able to rescue him and bring him back to the regiment, which was saved from destruction by timely reinforcements. But Gaunt was so severely injured that he almost died, and only the stubborn efforts of Dr. Kurth saved him. He was then fitted with top-of-the-line augmatic eyes, and his request for the Tanith to be rotated off the front lines was granted. Well, folks, that's all I got for this week. I hope you enjoyed this look into the famous Sabbat Crusades. My next batch of bonus boxes will be about another crusade, yet this one is still ongoing. The Achilles Crusade. If you enjoyed this box, please follow, like, comment, subscribe. And if you wish to help our channel, feel free to buy something in our shop, join our followers on Spotify, or become a member of our YouTube channel, Tales of Asharaka. Have a great day, and as always, until next time, this is Zeckthar, signing off.